The free-to-play market is an insanely competitive one, so when your game has been around for 10 years, you must be doing something right. 2022 marks the 10th anniversary of Phantasy Star Online 2, a game that many fans thought was doomed to never leave Japan. So grab your monomate and let's celebrate 10 years of Phantasy Star Online 2. My name's Zeo, and I'll be your lore keeper. Our tale begins in the year 2010. Phantasy Star Universe was still kicking on the Xbox 360 as well as the PC and PlayStation 2 for Japanese users. Phantasy Star Zero had also made its way to the rest of the world the previous year. There was also Phantasy Star Portable 2 on the PSP. 2010 marked the 10th anniversary of the original PSO, so it only made sense that SEGA would commemorate this by giving the world its first glimpse at the future of the franchise. The Tokyo Game Show in September of that year would introduce us to Phantasy Star Online 2. The original PSO is an important piece of online gaming history and still holds a place in the hearts of many a fan, including yours truly. The team behind PSO2 would be comprised of familiar names from previous entries. SEGA veteran Satoshi Sakai would take on the role of series producer. Before his time at SEGA, Sakai studied graphic design at Tama Art University in Tokyo, which is one of the top art schools in Japan. He was in his early 20s when he joined SEGA in 1994. This was the man responsible for the original PSO's distinct art style. He also served as writer and director for Phantasy Star Universe as well as the producer for the handheld titles. The role of director would change hands several times throughout the game's lifespan. The music was composed by a number of people over the years. One of the most notable contributors is series veteran Hideaki Kobayashi, who gave the original PSO its iconic sound. A star-studded voice cast would give life to the characters inhabiting PSO2's universe. The Japanese cast was a veritable who's who of all-star voice actors. Longtime anime fans will no doubt recognize names like Megumi Ogata, Kana Hanazawa, Takehito Koyasu, and Ryusei Nakao. You might remember Megumi as the voice of Shinji from Evangelion. Dragon Ball fans will no doubt recognize the name Ryusei Nakao as the Japanese voice of Frieza. Not to be outdone, the game's English cast had its share of star power too. The English dub would feature the talents of Cindy Robinson, Kira Buckland, Cam Clark, and Zach Aguilar. Sonic fans know Cindy Robinson as the voice of Amy Rose over the past decade. Fans of Demon Slayer know Zack as the voice of Tanjiro Kamado. Phantasy Star Online 2 began development sometime in 2008, and there was debate over whether to call it Phantasy Star Online 2 or Phantasy Star Universe 2. The game would be made available on Windows PCs, smartphones, and even the PlayStation Vita, which was known as the NGP at the time. Eventually, the game made its way to the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. Western fans would later see it on Xbox hardware for their version. PSO2 would be entirely free-to-play, a decision that was made at the start of the game's development. This was seen as a bold move, considering the game was in development for about the same time as some full-price AAA titles. SEGA would stick to their guns and pull out all the stops. The Asian free-to-play market was certainly white-hot and showed no signs of cooling down anytime soon. South Korea led the charge with heavy hitters like MapleStory and Dragon's Nest. The latter would serve as inspiration for PSO2's design. Like with the Japanese RPG Gold Rush in the 1980s, SEGA would carve out their niche here as well. In 2009, the Japanese PSU servers would transition from a subscription model to a free-to-play model using an in-game currency called Guardian's Cash in exchange for real-world money. Players could exchange this currency for access to special missions and items, so you could say this was their way of testing the waters, so to speak. The term free-to-play had garnered a nasty reputation over the years. That free part usually came with a huge asterisk. Developers would call their games free-to-play but have many of their gameplay elements locked behind a paywall. There was also the practice of having powerful items that could only be obtained randomly by using real-world money. It wasn't unheard of for young gamers to infuriate their parents by spending hundreds if not thousands on microtransactions. PSO2's paid features, however, were more about convenience than anything else. Players could purchase an in-game currency called ARX Cash or AC with real money and use it to buy certain in-game items. Players could use AC to buy things such as extra inventory slots and storage space. They could also buy premium packs, which let them use features like an extra storage box or the ability to sell items in their personal shops. The game made the bulk of its money through a system called the AC Scratch, which allowed the player to receive a random item in exchange for a little bit of AC. These items were part of a themed AC Scratch which rotated out every month and could be sold to other players through the personal shops. Potential items ranged from clothing and accessories to emotes and character voices. There were also items that increased the chance of successful equipment upgrades, but these weren't game-breaking. The game featured several collaboration events with other popular games in anime over the years. Fans of Guilty Gear, the Fate series, and even Sword Art Online could make themselves into their favorite main characters, voices and all. They even collaborated with a few non-gaming brands like 7-Eleven and Don Quixote. PSO2 would have some of the fairest implementations of these systems. The game was built so that players didn't have to spend any money if they didn't want to, yet have the same experience as those who did. In fact, there are many players who've enjoyed the game for years doing just that. There was another in-game currency called Fun, which players accrued by doing things in-game. A separate Fun Scratch was also available and featured a rotating assortment of cosmetic items in addition to 3-day room and shop passes. The Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu would sit down with series producer Satoshi Sakai, who would share his thoughts on this. Sakai had stated that there is nothing that requires payment that will take away from the intrinsic game experience if they are not purchased. SEGA was always known for being an industry innovator with ideas that were ahead of their time. However, these ideas were implemented with varying degrees of success. Win or lose, they always seemed to leave their mark on the industry. The Phantasy Star franchise itself was a prime example of this. SEGA wanted to change the online game market and show the world what a free-to-play online RPG could be. Sakai had also stated to Famitsu that, "We are seeking to create a business model that functions while still allowing PSO2 to remain as much of an enjoyable experience as possible." I honestly think that SEGA is the only maker that is willing to go this far. Even if we fail, if we can get people to say, they were 5 years ahead of their time, then I'll have no regrets. I believe that there's meaning in the challenge itself. The game's story centers around the conflict between a group of spacefaring scientists called Arcs and Darkfalls alongside hordes of creatures called Fallspawn, or Darkers as they're known in Japan. The player assumes the role of a rookie Arcs operative at the start of the game. The dialogue of certain characters on the ship changed as the player progressed through the story. Character progression was independent of the main story, so players didn't have to complete it if they didn't want to. An overarching theme of the story is that our actions, as well as our inaction, can have major implications. It also illustrates the lengths to which one will go to make things right. When we come back, we'll take a look at the early phases of the game leading up to its launch in the summer of 2012.
SEGA はロールプレイングゲームも変えてしまう。ファンタシースター。かつてない驚異のグラフィック、壮大な SF ストーリー。その秘密は4メガ。ファンタシースター。PSE Burst.
The game took elements from its predecessors and greatly improved on them. It took the familiar weapons from previous iterations and even added a few new ones, like wired lances and jet boots. Photon arts would also make a comeback, but this time players could chain them together instead of just having one assigned to a particular weapon. Also, instead of leveling up PAs and techniques like in PSU, players found them during their adventures as discs. And for the first time in this series, players had the ability to jump. The early prototype for the game looked very different from the final product. Even the logo and the user interface were totally different. The prototype featured music and sound effects from Phantasy Star Universe as placeholders, and showed a party fighting their way through a less war-torn cityscape than the one we'd ultimately get. SEGA was much more thorough when it came to stress testing this time around. The Japanese launch of Phantasy Star Universe in 2006 was a particularly rocky one, having only one closed beta test. The game had 5 times more registered accounts than what their servers were equipped to handle. The servers had to be shut down within 48 hours of going live, followed by a complete character wipe after reports of item duplication had surfaced. The servers came back up several days later, but things were still touch and go for the first month. SEGA wasn't about to repeat this mistake. An alpha test for PSO2 was announced in February of 2011 alongside the release of Phantasy Star Portable 2 Infinity in Japan, and was more in line with what we'd see in the final game. The first alpha took place in the summer of that year, and a second test was held at the beginning of the following year. In the spring of 2012, SEGA held a closed beta test, followed by 2 open beta tests that summer leading up to the game's official launch. The closed beta served to test a number of features such as the AC Shop and AC Scratch. In the closed beta, players would obtain a Rappy suit if they managed to win all 8 outfits in the ticket. This feature would not make it into the final game though. This was a controversial monetization system called a complete gacha. If players were lucky enough to win all the items in a specified set, they'd receive a bonus item. This was an insanely popular and lucrative mechanic in Japanese social games. It wasn't unheard of for players to dump hundreds of thousands, if not millions of yen into these games just for that one bonus item. This infuriated many consumers and parents who felt this was akin to gambling. This put these companies in the crosshairs of the Consumer Affairs Agency, who had banned the practice in 2012 after the closed beta had wrapped up. This scandal caused these companies' stock values to tank in an event that was dubbed the Comp Gacha Shock. The PR and financial blowback caused these companies to form their own self-regulatory committee. On July 4th, 2012, Phantasy Star Online 2 made its official debut in Japan. An official English release was announced a few days later, but overeager Western fans were already enjoying the game thanks to the efforts of a few devoted fans. Those who were fluent in Japanese set to work on translating official interviews and news articles. Tech-savvy fans plied their skills by translating the game itself. While we can't discuss the specifics of this technological sorcery, we can't let these efforts go completely unacknowledged. After all, they're just as much a part of the game's legacy as anything on the official side. The game's population was spread out between 10 servers dubbed ships, named after the runic alphabet. The first 4 ships filled up very quickly, prompting SEGA to restrict the creation of new characters for the opening weeks. A few days after the Japanese launch, SEGA announced that Western fans would be getting PSO2 in early 2013. The original PSO2.com teaser site would go live soon after. But once again, the Japanese servers would be hived off from everyone else, citing international gambling laws and cultural differences as their reasoning. They would also be getting content several months behind Japan, which was the norm for games like this. When it came to PSO2, this fan base was split between 2 very distinct camps. On one hand, you had the waiter crowd, who was determined to wait patiently for an official localization of the game. They simply wanted to play the game with friends and family, with as few barriers to entry as possible. On the other hand, there were those who jumped right in with the Japanese version. This group had its own 2 factions. One side just wanted to play the game, and if an official localization ever did surface, they would switch over to that version. And then you have the people who decided they weren't going anywhere, even if the game ever did receive an official localization. These players poured thousands of hours into the game, many of whom had accumulated billions of Meseta worth of in-game items over the years. Many of these people were also longtime fans, starting with PSU, or even as far back as PSO on the Dreamcast. They remembered the days of receiving content several months after Japan, if they were even fortunate to get it in the first place. They still wanted to enjoy and support the game, but on their terms. They didn't mind jumping through a few extra hoops for what they felt was a better experience than any domestic release could offer. International users faced a number of obstacles right out of the gate. Creating an account required a Japanese physical address as well as solving a CAPTCHA that was written in hiragana. But once again, resourceful fans found ways around these obstacles. Buying ARX cash was also a challenge. SEGA's payment processor didn't accept foreign credit cards, so players had to obtain AC through prepaid means like web money. The easiest ways to obtain web money were through sites like SudoCorp and PlayAsia. These services resold web money at marked up prices. On top of that, the dollar to yen exchange rate was the lowest it had been since the mid-90s. So, 3,000 AC would set you back roughly $40 US. The importer struggle was very real. PlayStation Vita owners could take the game wherever they wanted beginning in early 2013. The Vita version had a slightly different user interface as well as its own set of blocks. The gameplay was about the same, but battle areas had fewer enemies on screen. Want to hear something cool? Episode 1 had 2 different final chapters between the PC and Vita versions. PC users had what we'd come to know as Arcs and Darkfalls as their finale. Vita users had the Idol and the Rampaging Dragon for theirs. This ended up being changed within a couple weeks though. 2013 would also bring the first major expansion dubbed Episode 2 that summer. Episode 2 introduced the Dooman race and the Braver class, as well as a new planet to explore. The year was more than half over, and the Waiter crowd was left in the lurch. Sega's North American and European branches underwent a series of layoffs that year, leaving fans to wonder if their version of PSO2 was even coming out at all. 2013 came and went, with nary a whisper from Sega about PSO2 in the West. 2014 would have several important milestones for the game, the first of which came in the spring of that year when PSO2S made its debut on iOS and Android devices. The original idea for PSO2S was a modified port of the PC version, but that idea was ultimately scrapped. PSO2S was a menu-based game with a point-and-click style battle system. PSO2S had its own storyline that wasn't tied to the main game story. PSO2S served as both a standalone game and a companion app for the main game. Players signed into the game using their existing PSO2 account, which allowed them to feed their megs, use personal shops, or buy AC on the go. There were also items and augments that weren't available in the main game. It also gave players access to an additional storage box for use in PSO2 proper. This also made it easier for users outside Japan to purchase AC. Anyone with a Google Play account could now buy their AC without the exorbitant markup or conversion fees. Around that time, PSO2 made its debut outside Japan, but not where you would think. Southeast Asian fans would get the game thanks to Asiasoft, who published Ragnarok Online and MapleStory in that region. Unfortunately, Asiasoft was notorious for its blatant pay-to-win mechanics, and PSO2 was no exception. For example, outfits had potentials and significant stat boosts. The localization wasn't the greatest either, and the translators took a number of creative liberties. Forces were called wizards, and bravers were called samurai. Techniques were called magic, which completely flew in the face of Phantasy Star lore. The game encountered a massive string of DDoS attacks that summer. This led many foreign players to think Sega put a geo-block in place, but the main issue here was the routing between Yahoo Japan and certain foreign ISPs. The summer of 2014 would see the rollout of Episode 3 in Japan, bringing the new Bouncer class with it. Episode 3 would take us to another new planet and serve as the climactic finale for the game's first major story arc. This also brought back the casino, which was also a fan favorite from PSU, and featured more games than just slots and roulette. In 2015, Episode 3 gave players plenty to do with the introduction of Challenge Mode and Ultimate Quests. The game was doing very well at this time, with Sega reporting over 3.5 million registered users at the time. The latter part of 2015 would bring the story to a close and give us a glimpse into the future. As for PSO2 in the West, when we come back, PSO2 goes anime and heads to a rather familiar location.
セガネットゲーム。
勇気を出して言葉にしよう。
はじめまして。一緒に冒険しませんか？
はじめましてから始まる RPG ファンタシースターオンライン。
One more!
2016 would be the first time fans outside of Asia would get PSO2, but not the actual game. Phantasy Star Online 2, the animation, made its debut on January 7, 2016, with the show being simulcast on Crunchyroll the next day. PSO2, the animation, is set in Tokyo, but in 2027, which would make the game around 15 years old in our time. Later that month, Episode 4 would launch, accompanied by a number of sweeping changes to the game and even a revamped logo. Episode 4 would signal a major pivot both in terms of storytelling and gameplay. Keisuke Nakamura would take on the role of director, with a young buck named Daiki Hamazaki as his co-director. Hamazaki had worked on Phantasy Star Portable 2 and Phantasy Star Zero before that. Nakamura was focused on the upcoming PS4 version, while Hamazaki focused on the PC side. One of PSO2's biggest draws was its excellent character customization. The already powerful character creation engine became even more powerful. Players were given 2 more accessory slots and the ability to change their size and positions. Players could also dress their characters up or down with the addition of layering wear. Upgrading weapons also became less of an RNG-dependent nightmare with the introduction of new type weapons. Before this system, players had to upgrade their weapon of choice to plus 10, and then do it again 3 more times to obtain its level 3 potential. This was especially frustrating for 13-star weapons, which needed special grinders to upgrade. The new type system let players fill up an experience bar by using other weapons. Stronger weapons naturally meant higher increases. Players still needed multiple copies of the same weapon to reach plus 35 though. Units, however, still used the old system. Episode 4 would also introduce the pet-centered summoner class in addition to skill rings and gathering. Story-wise, Episode 4 took place 2 years after the previous episode. The events of PSO2 the animation took place 1 year prior to Episode 4's story. Episode 4 also introduced a new currency called Star Gems, which could be obtained by doing things in-game or purchased with AC. Star Gems had a number of uses such as resetting collection file and gathering cooldowns. There were also SG scratches that had the chance to award players with costumes and emotes used by their favorite story characters. PSO2 would also make its console debut on PlayStation 4 in April of that year. 2017 was an important year not just for PSO2, but for the entire Phantasy Star franchise. Not only was this PSO2's 5th year in service, but also the franchise's 30th anniversary. The original Phantasy Star had launched in Japan just 2 days after the release of Final Fantasy. SEGA's contract with Asiasoft was ending, which meant the closure of PSO2 in Southeast Asian territories. July of 2017 would see the release of Episode 5, which was another pivot in terms of gameplay and narrative. This was also where Mr. Hamazaki would make his controversial solo directorial debut. New episodes meant new classes, and Episode 5 was no exception, but things were a bit different this time around. Episode 5 would introduce players to what would be called successor classes, the first of which being dubbed Hero. But players couldn't just pick up this class right out the gate though. They had to put in some work on the other classes first. Hero was an interesting hybrid class that made use of swords, twin machine guns, and taluses, but they behaved differently from their non-successor counterparts. Each weapon had their own unique set of photon arts that didn't require leveling up. Skillful players received a damage boost that increased over time and had access to powerful counterattacks on top of that, but that bonus was lost if the player took too much damage. It also had a skill that increased attack power once activated. Players could activate the skill once a gear meter was filled up. If players used the skill again before the meter ran out, they would unleash a powerful finishing attack. That meter filled up faster by utilizing all 3 weapons effectively. Hero was a totally different animal from the other 9 classes. It couldn't have a subclass, nor could it be used as one. Hero hit all the right spots for what made a class enjoyable. It was strong, stylish, and fast-paced. The strongest criticism of the class was that it was, well, too strong, to the point where it essentially obsoleted the other 9 classes. SEGA would roll out some sweeping balance changes over the latter half of 2017. The other classes were in a better spot, but Hero was still the top dog here. Additionally, players lamented the lack of any meaningful content apart from different flavors of Buster Quests. On the PSO2 Western front, the tail end of 2017 brought with it another interesting development. After 5 years, the English PSO2.com teaser site had finally gone dark. By this time, however, many of those who were holding out either jumped on the Japanese servers or just moved on altogether. The continued existence of that website served as a candle of hope for an official Western release. But that candle was finally snuffed out. In April of 2018, PSO2 would appear on Nintendo Switch, but this one made use of cloud technology. Cloud gaming eliminated the need for large file downloads. PC and cloud players could team up on designated blocks, but they were still hived off from their PS4 and Vita friends. To make this all the more special, there was even a collaboration event with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Players could now cosplay as Link, complete with the iconic Master Sword and Hylian Shield. The first year of Episode 5 was certainly a difficult one. Balancing issues, lack of content, and a litany of bugs had prompted a mass exodus from the game. The dev team had to do some major damage control. With the bug fixes, balance changes, and 14-star weapons becoming more obtainable, the developers had slowly regained the trust of their fans. The Phantasy Star team had something else up their sleeves for the franchise's 30th anniversary. In November of 2018, Idola Phantasy Star Saga made its debut on iOS and Android devices in Japan. Idola was set in the fantastical world of Vandor sometime after the events of PSO2's story. The swords and sorcery atmosphere was a drastic departure from PSO2's sci-fi atmosphere. A few days before Idola's launch, SEGA made a rather interesting job listing. They were looking for a programmer and a UI planner, specifically for a Phantasy Star project. This fueled speculation of a possible PSO3 in the works. PSO2 was long in the tooth by this time, so it only made sense that SEGA would start laying the groundwork for a successor. When we come back, PSO2 returns to its roots, and the announcement the world thought would never come.
きなキャラ作っておしゃれするの楽しいのに。みんなで一緒に戦うの楽しいのに。冒険以外にも楽しいこといっぱいあるのに。ねえ、なんでやらないの？
基本無料の本格オンライン RPG PSO2。
PS4 あるなら一緒にやろう。
For episode 6, Tetsuo Yoshioka was placed in the director's chair. Mr. Yoshioka was an avid gamer who had also played PSO2 since the alpha. He didn't like where he felt the game was going at the time, so he joined SEGA in 2013, having no prior video game industry experience. Here's a man who just enjoyed gaming and wanted to improve the game he loved from within. Yoshioka was able to empathize with players because he was a player himself, and this player-centered mindset would serve him well. Episode 6 was released on April 24th of 2019, bringing with it several quality-of-life changes as well as the new Phantom class. Work on Episode 6 began in 2017, and it would serve as a continuation of Episode 5. The last 2 episodes took place in alternate dimensions, but Yoshioka wanted to bring the setting back to its spacefaring roots this time around. Phantom had a much darker aesthetic than Hero, and wasn't nearly as overpowered gameplay-wise. Just like with Hero, Phantom made use of 3 existing weapons but with their own unique movesets. Phantoms had access to katanas, rods, and rifles. They could also fire off techniques in rapid succession in exchange for reduced potency. Believe it or not, the speed at which they fired off these spells more than made up for that. They also had access to a powerful finishing attack just like with Hero. Unlike Hero though, players could use Phantom as a subclass for the 9 base classes. Our story once again returns to the Western Hemisphere. The 25th Electronic Entertainment Expo was about to get underway in Los Angeles, California in June of that year. Several companies held press conferences in the days leading up to the convention itself. On June 9th, Microsoft would showcase a number of major titles such as Cyberpunk 2077, Borderlands 3, and Elden Ring. But there was one game that show attendees and fans watching at home were not expecting. After the trailer, Xbox head Phil Spencer came on stage and said a few words. Those of you who have played Phantasy Star know that this game had influenced many of the most popular games today. So with great delight, we welcome SEGA back to our stage and Phantasy Star back on Xbox. During that trailer, they made a rather bold declaration. They were bringing all the content, which by this point was almost 8 years worth. The wait was finally over. And it wouldn't just be on Xbox either. The English PSO2 website came back online with a complete overhaul. More details about PSO2's Western release would come out over the latter half of the year. The game would feature cross-play between Xbox One and PC users, much like how PC and PlayStation users in Japan could play together. However, Xbox One owners would be getting first dibs on the game, with PC users to follow soon after. PSO2 would once again appear in anime form. Phantasy Star Online 2 Episode Oracle made its debut in October of 2019. Episode Oracle was produced by Gonzo, who worked on anime like Kaleidostar and Final Fantasy Unlimited. Episode Oracle served as a condensed retelling of PSO2's first 3 episodes. The story here was much darker than in the game, and Planet Harukatan was completely omitted. Meanwhile in Japan, Episode 6 was still chugging along. One complaint about successor classes in Episode 5 was that there was just one, so SEGA rolled out another one in December of that year, Etoile. Hero and Phantom were strong offensively, but Etoile had a more defensive playstyle. Just like Phantom, Etoile could be used as a subclass for the 9 base classes. Etoile followed the same pattern as the other 2 successor classes, but making use of wands, double sabers, and dual blades. When we come back, the day that English-speaking PSO2 fans have been waiting for, nearly 8 years in the making.
最大級のオンライン RPG PSO2 が新エピソードに突入。初の上級クラスヒーローで今までにない圧倒的な英雄感。舞台は中世ファンタジー。巨大な魔人城を破壊するバスタークエスト。そして豪華声優陣が集結。
甘く見ないでください。落ち着いてください。
一人の人間だ。
進化を遂げた伝説の RPG ファンタシースターオンライン2。
Crossburst!
"2020 was finally here, and PSO2 held a 3-day closed beta test for Xbox One players in North America. Unlike other closed beta tests, players actually got to keep their progress into the open beta and then into the final game. The closed beta received some glowing praise from fans and gaming press alike. The 4-week open beta would begin the following month and end on April 14th to coincide with the game's official launch. PSO2's initial North American offering was a rather interesting chimera. Not only were the first 3 episodes available at the start, but all 9 base classes were there too. On top of that, the game rolled out with several of the balance and quality of life changes from the latter episodes. North American players already had gathering and skill rings as well as new type weapons right out of the gate. The localization took some liberties with item and ability names. For example, Darkers were called Fallspawn, and the 2 regions of Haruko-tan were called Daybreak and Nightfall provinces. A number of weapon and skill names were changed too. The Ranger skill Weak Bullet was changed to Blight Rounds, and the Fighter's skill Limit Break was called Overload here. Successor classes were also called Scion classes. Many classes made use of a gear mechanic for their weapons, but this was renamed to Focus. Dual blades were also renamed Soaring Blades. The flavor text for weapons and some items was also gone. Meanwhile, in Japan, SEGA showed fans what they could expect over the summer. Summoners were getting new pets, and this was also where players got their first look at the mysterious new Gunblade class slated to release in August. They also gave a hint at the game's future, which they simply called Not Episode 7. But this was around the time that several companies began working from home, and SEGA was no exception. So that meant all the updates planned for that summer were pushed back a month, including the end of PS Vita service. PSO2 would finally come to North American PC players via the Microsoft Windows 10 store on May 27th. The Windows 10 version of the game had several bugs that prevented players from even installing the game, let alone playing it. Once again, the fans would come to the rescue with various fixes and workarounds until things were ironed out. In July of that year, we learned what the Japanese developers meant by Not Episode 7. The Xbox Game Showcase would give fans worldwide a glimpse at PSO2's future, dubbed New Genesis, or NGS. NGS would feature an overhauled graphics engine and take place in a brand new open world. Players of the original game could keep their hard-earned cosmetics and equipment, but character progression and money would be different in the new game. Players could also come and go between NGS and base PSO2 as they pleased, effectively making this 2 games in one. On August 5th, PSO2 made its way onto Steam alongside Episode 4 in North America and other territories. This was the point where PSO2 NA became PSO2 Global. So far, the global team was delivering on their promise of all the content made in the announcement trailer. They did, however, make a few changes to appease a more censorious Western audience. For example, the infamous bathhouse scenes from Episode 4 were cut despite being fully dubbed. On top of that, characters who appeared naked in certain scenes were covered up. Fans of PSO2 Global had plenty to keep them busy as they were getting content updates at breakneck speeds. In September of that year, the PSO2 Global team launched a series of live streams dubbed Dark's Hour to showcase upcoming content much like the Japanese PSO2 station streams. The show was hosted by the social media team and featured some of the community's favorite YouTube personalities. The very first episode showcased Episode 5 in the Hero class, which was coming out at the end of the month. The broadcast aired on Twitch and YouTube and ran for a total of 8 episodes. Meanwhile, Episode 6 was wrapping up for Japanese players, and they'd get the long-awaited Gunblade class, Luster. Unlike other classes, Luster made use of Gunblades exclusively, but they were broken into 3 distinct styles based on the weapon's element. For example, a darker fire element Gunblade belonged to the hard-hitting, close-ranged Fomel style. All 3 styles had the same moveset, but they each had their own set of nuances. Luster was strong, stylish, dynamic, and fast-paced. It certainly lived up to the developer's vision of that secret character you unlock after beating the game. Around that time, Boltron Games published Idola in North America, with European audiences getting it the following month. But unlike with the Japanese version, there was no connectivity with PSO2 proper. 2020 would close out with PSO2 Global getting Episode 6, but this time Phantom and Etoile rolled out together. In 2021, NGS was gearing up for its closed beta in Japan, the first of which was held in February. The game received high marks for its class design and graphics, as well as the new elements like the Photon Dash. The majority of players were excited to get their hands on the final product. PSO2 would undergo a major graphical overhaul in March ahead of New Genesis. The character creation engine was also evolving. Japanese players got first dibs on these new features, while global users had to wait until the release of NGS. The global side would get the final parts of Episode 6 over the ensuing months. The game would also make its way onto the Epic Games Store around this time. So in addition to Xbox, PC players could have the game on their distribution platform of choice. Jamming nearly a decade's worth of content within the span of a year was certainly no small feat. The global team actually managed to pull off this Herculean task, even in the face of everything that was happening in the world. When we come back, one era ends, a new one begins. And then, let's wrap it up with some very important questions.
Game が夢見てたゲーム。全世界ネットワーク RPG ファンタシースターオンライン
Burst finish!
The day was finally here. Phantasy Star Online 2, New Genesis, made its worldwide debut on June 9th of 2021, exactly 2 years after the announcement of PSO2's Western release. Hamasaki was back in the director's chair, much to the dismay of those who remember him from Episode 5. Unlike with the base game, players from both regions would get content at the same time. However, Japan was still roped off from everyone else due to international gambling laws. Even in the wake of the international release, there were still a number of foreign players who didn't completely switch over. These players faced another hurdle with the release of NGS in the form of a geo-block. The game launched with 6 classes, a short story chapter, and 1 region. Each class had their signature weapons and skills from the base game, and also incorporated a number of elements from the Scion classes. Players had much more mobility than before, and the open world took full advantage of this. The game was now more popular than ever, and Phantasy Star brand awareness was at an all-time high. But as with any other MMO launch, the honeymoon phase was short-lived. While many felt the game had an enjoyable foundation, most players breezed through everything it had to offer within a week. On top of that, NGS was missing several important quality of life features that were in the base game. The initial plan was to roll out Braver in August, and then Bouncer in October, followed by the first major update in December that would introduce the Retem region. The Summoner class was to be released in spring of 2022, with the yet unnamed Gunblade class to make its debut that summer. But the fans on both sides were not pleased, and they weren't exactly bashful about airing their grievances. The blowback from fans over the first 6 months would prompt SEGA to shift their focus towards offering more content in between major updates. As a result, they had to put Summoners and Gunblades on the back burner. Over the next several months, they'd reintroduce the missing quality of life features. The second major update released on June 8th of 2022, and it seemed that SEGA had taken the game's strongest critiques to heart. By this point, the formula for this game had been firmly established, but with some non-combat elements added in. NGS was starting to feel like a more complete package, but players on both sides still felt there was much more room for improvement. PSO2 NGS has certainly faced its share of challenges over the past year. This begs some important questions though. Has SEGA truly done enough to regain the trust of its fans? What are the longevity prospects for NGS in light of SEGA's recent Super Game announcements? Would PSO2 have done well outside Japan had that version gone live in 2013? What else do they have up their sleeves for the franchise's 35th anniversary? One day, the PSO2 universe will be naught but a memory. Our painstakingly crafted characters will be gone as well. The infamous Error 630 message will appear on our screens one more time, and that will be that. These worlds and characters may not be real, but the time we shared together certainly was. The memories we forged through our countless adventures shall live on inside us forevermore. To better understand who we are and where we're going, we need to understand where we came from. These words ring true, be they in our world or one of fiction. So if you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Here's to 10 years of PSO2 and whatever the future holds for the Phantasy Star franchise. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and thank you, PSO2. And remember, to thine own self be true. Until next time, farewell.